you ask an open-ended question, they're gonna give you the shortest response possible. However, if you ask a closed-ended question, it is gonna be yes or no every time. Alright, so these being typically how we will start. Open is, how has that impacted you? Why or what about that goal stands out to you? Why is this important? Alright, so some of the stems that what is usually asking for facts and information, why a discussion of reasons, how an exploration of feeling or emotion, and then could, can, and would as well. Typically though, you will try to avoid why questions in general because they can come off as judgmental. I think I mentioned that last week as a like, why would you do that? And things like that. And so sometimes why questions do come off that way, and so really leaning on these other 5. Alright, some of the common questions that really can help just get your session moving, and some kind of standard questions to use in sessions is, can you tell me more about that? How did you feel when that happened? Given what you just said, what would be your ideal solution? Again, kind of a little bit of a reframe of the miracle question. What might have we missed so far? What else comes to your mind? But these are just kind of general questions that can apply to a lot of different situations. Again, if you're thinking through like, oh, where do I go from there? How do I ask a follow-up? How do we go a little bit deeper through in this question of just, how'd you feel? Can you tell me more? And granted, if every time they stop talking, you ask, could you tell me more about that? Because that's kind of what the standard one you see in a lot of shows. Tell me more about that. Your clients are going to be annoyed with that, and that's where variation of skill is really important. But these are just some standard common questions that can help facilitate open-ended dialogue. Raising awareness, and so thinking through your own empathetic response. Specifically with questions, could you give me a specific example, or what do you mean? Because with understanding what's going on with them is they may be telling you like, oh, this is why I want to do something, or this is what would be the result of this goal, but you can't really picture like what that would look like in real life, right? Just saying, can you give me a specific example of what that would look like? Or what do you mean by this? And asking for a little bit more clarity in order to raise your own awareness into what they're talking about. If you don't know, like they've given you a goal and you really don't understand what that goal is going to look like, it's going to be hard for you to help facilitate them meeting that goal. So you can ask clarifying questions, and it's not a feeling of, oh, I'm just too dumb to get this, but just saying like, what does it look like for them? And have them explain it to you and ask those clarifying instead of ignoring it and saying like, oh, I'll eventually figure out as we go what they mean by this. No, get that clarity from the beginning.
What if they ask a question back, like, what do you think about it? Or they tell you a problem, but they ask you, what is your opinion about this?
Okay, so we talked about last class is that we don't give advice.
Yes, but so how do you still respond? Like,
how do you think people respond? Any suggestions? Yeah, because it's gonna be, you're gonna have clients, you're gonna have people who say like, well, what do you think I should do?
Maybe saying that I don't live their lives, and this is not of their decision. They have to learn how to make these decisions. They know, they're experts of their lives. So they know better. Something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, you're the expert on you. And so, if I were to tell you what to do, that would be me saying that you're not the expert on your own self. I'm the expert on me.
And if they ask why, like, why do I have these dreams, or why do I act like this?
Let's talk about the dreams. Let's talk about the way you act. And explore your own motives. I can't say why you do something or why something's popping up here, but we can explore why it's popping up for you.
Because it's like a little bit, like the chapter says how sometimes clients look at you as someone wiser, smarter, and stuff like that. And maybe they expect us to give all the answers, like why do
Yeah.
you behave this way, like that.
Instead, giving them the agency and the empowerment to know that they can explore and develop their own answers.
And even if we know the answer, we don't give the answer.
Yeah, so sometimes you can reflect underlying meaning back to them. If something you can, and that's a later class. But just giving your clients all the answers so they're dependent on you for answers is not the goal of counseling. Also, kind of a repeat from last class is maintaining positive regard. How do you work towards a growth in that? And so some questions that can focus on strengths, not always deficits, is can you tell me a story about a success you've had sometime in your past? What are your current support systems? What are some things that you are proud of? What do you do well? What do others say you do well? I usually always ask questions similar to these in my first session, because especially working with children and adolescents, my clients have been told like how bad they are about certain things, right? They've been told the areas that they need to work on, but they rarely have somebody say like, what are you good at? And what are your strengths? What are your support systems? And so focusing on those positives, and usually what I say is we use our strengths to overcome our weaknesses and promote them to growth. Is that this is a way that if this is already a strength of yours, how can we use it to overcome this other area where you may need support? Alright. So some also exceptions that I usually look for with clients is a lot of times with particularly negative things is they'll think like this always happens or this never happens. And so getting your clients to think of like, is there a time that there's an exception to this rule? That we always have to do this, or mom never lets me do this. There's never been a time that like she lets you play, I think I had a client in particular that mom had a 3-hour-a-week limit on video games. So that was essentially like 30 minutes a day is what they got, but it was 3.5 hours over the week. And they were allowed to like, if they wanted to use all 3 hours, like 3.5 hours on one day, they could, or they could get a half an hour every day. And so my client with ADHD and impulsivity usually used up all his hours on Monday. And mom never lets him go over. Mom, and talking about boundaries and things like that. But just even challenging it, mom has never let you play like for more than that, or it's never been an exception to that rule. And it's, well, mom did let me have extra time on my birthday. Oh, so if there's a special occasion. Yeah, and in the summer she doesn't have a limit. It's only during the school year. Oh, so there are exceptions to that rule. It's not an all the time rule, but when you're going to school, and this is kind of the boundary that she has during the school year, but on your birthday, during the summer, there are exceptions to that rule. And just kind of getting, not to challenge mom's rule or anything, but just give perspective taking within it. You're saying that this is mom's rule all the time, but we've actually already found some exceptions to it. Because few problems happen all the time, so can you tell me about the time it didn't happen? What is the difference about this example versus the usual? Let's focus on exceptions. When is this problem absent? But with the question, we do want to avoid bombardment or grilling. Too many questions can give too much control to the interviewer, and it can put the client more in a defensive position. Asking multiple questions at a time, which we can rapidly think of. You may be talking with your client and they've just kind of unloaded, and you've got like so many questions to ask and follow through, and you're afraid you're going to forget one, and so you ask multiple questions. Really making sure that you're only just asking one question so they can give you a response back. Sometimes we do ask questions as statements, using a way to tell it from your own point of view. But if you're going to make a statement, don't frame it as a question like, don't you think it would be helpful if you studied more? What occurs to you as you think about improving your grade? Instead, make it a statement it's not helpful for you to study more, right? That's what they consider. Or ask it as a question saying, how would it look if you studied more? Just to provide clarity within that. Again, why questions can put interviewers and interviewees more in a defensive position. Questions are both best learned after expertise is developed, and the reflective listening skills. So one of the things that I had to do as part of my training program, and I do not make it a requirement, but we were actually supposed to do sessions where we didn't ask questions at all, where you either made reflective statements or affirmations or summaries, but you couldn't ask any questions during the whole session. And that's really, it can be hard to lean on when you're wanting to know more information to get into that interrogation mode. And usually what I suggest is, you guys, as we go through the skills, you guys are all gonna lean towards one. I've noted that, in the last few years of teaching this, is when you watch your tapes, really just putting on a piece of paper the ors, and every time you respond to your client, mark down what skill you used. And at the end of the session, if you're like, okay, I did 2 affirmations, 2 reflections, 2 summaries, but I asked 5 questions, well, that tends to mean you lean towards questioning, right? Some of you guys are really gonna love affirmations, and so you may be affirming everything your client says throughout the whole session. And that's gonna be the skill you lean towards, but you still wanna diversify this. And typically that first session, there seems to be a lot of questions. And recognize that you can reflect, you can paraphrase back, you don't have to respond always with a question. Alright, so again, just some considerations, it does put you in a position of power. There can be a cultural difference, even just a sense of distrust in initial sessions. You don't want to ask too many questions or rapid firing, and if asking sensitively can destroy trust as well. Honoring the cultural background, making sure that you've created a safe place, but don't lean too heavily on the question. So sometimes with thinking through questions, this is ABCTE is from Rational Emotive Behavioral Therapy, and that's really looking at drawing out a story, focusing on the observable concrete actions, helping the client see the results from that, and then their thoughts relating to that behind it, and the emotions that go with it as well. And so when you're having a question about the goal, is whatever goal they've come up with, why is that important to them? What part of their story has made that goal in particular stand out for what they want to work on? Focus on observable concrete actions. What would be the outcome if they make that goal? They have to take these steps, and this will be the consequence, like miracle question, this is what would be the outcome if they had better time management, or if they weren't procrastinating or had better relationships with friends, this would be the outcome based on what particular thoughts they have or the emotions that they have related to that goal. And so thinking through this first session, we're just really exploring these 3 areas. But when we start to get to insight, we're looking at the thoughts and the feelings that go behind those goals. And so we are moving through this, and we are primarily staying in person-centered. And like I said, this is REBT, but this is just another way to conceptualize it. Is here we are just kind of exploring these 3 points. Why is this important? What would be the outcome if it changed? And then these thoughts and emotions would be more in when we get into the insight phase. All right. Any questions about open-ended questions and utilizing them? And the core leaders have 2 activities. You guys will practice with open-ended questions and reflecting feeling tonight in your small groups.
About eye contact and body language, actually, I wonder if you can talk more about that, because I feel like I've noticed some people, for example, like when we're walking side to side or like driving in a car, they actually talk better because we're not making eye contact.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering how you would reconcile somebody who's
So that's paying attention to like the cultural differences. So there are people that are just going to be hesitant to make eye contact, and it's not always, you don't realize how often you don't make eye contact, again, focusing on other things. So sometimes it's just like the norm. But for some people, they didn't grow up making eye contact with people. And so kind of paying attention if they're like, no, I just don't feel comfortable, or if they are making eye contact, but then certain times they're not making eye contact, saying is like, is it the discussion part versus going thing, or is it just having someone give you one-on-one space for 50 minutes is also a long time. And some people aren't used to like that amount of attention, right? Because how long do you sit with people for like 50 minutes with minimal distractors? You may go to a coffee shop with somebody for an hour, but there are a lot of distractors going on through that process. If you feel like it's actually impeding the counseling session, bring it up in the forefront and say like, hey, I just noticed this. Like, you know, when we talked about this, you weren't making eye contact. If you feel like it's cultural, accepting that. Of going like, oh, are you comfortable making eye contact? Are there times that they make eye contact and then other times they don't? Is it changing? But if you know that it's just their personal preference, you don't necessarily have to push that into the session.
In the text, there was a section, I can't remember, it was chapter 2, I think it was 4, where it was talking about when you lose focus, when you distract during a session, and the example of how to work with that is just basically admitting it. It's like, hey, I found myself, you know, losing focus or distancing. When I read that, it was difficult to imagine myself just admitting that I wasn't paying attention. Do you have any advice for when that does occur?
So I do find it very important to make sure you're in a present space with clients, and you know, a lot of times you're gonna have things going on in your own life, and being able to, you know, stop yourself and be fully present for others is really a critical skill. That's where I said is we think active listening is the easy part of our jobs, and it's actually very intentional. It can be very difficult as well. For me, in the times that I kind of have lost track, I've just told the client, not necessarily that I wasn't with it, like, hey, you lost me there. So I need you to kind of clarify a little bit of like, of the point that I can go to, of like, hey, this is the issue that we're dealing with, let's map this out step by step. A lot of times then I will pull out my notebook. I usually don't take notes during a session, but I'll pull out a notebook and like, let's map out this problem. What's like the first issue, or if it's a client that I've done the antecedent behavior and consequence I've done with a lot of clients, let's break this down. What happened before that led up to it, and what happened afterwards. And that kind of gets them, that we're still using an intervention, we're breaking it down, and it gets it on a concrete piece of paper for me. Of breaking that piece down and kind of reaffirming where we're at. And so that's usually how I typically handle with it. Because also I have clients that do have ADHD, severe ADHD, and there have been times that I'm like, hey, we jumped around so much just with the how you're doing that I actually don't know what you want to focus on this week. Because I was tracking with them, but they brought up like 6 different problems. So I'll say like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, these are the issues, which one do we want to focus on and process today? And that can just be true if you have clients that can go multiple different directions, or follow other rabbit trails using kind of a concrete example there.
Do you find there's a good, if the client is starting to do and then this led to this, and then this led to this, is there a polite way or a way that won't make them feel on guard to maybe redirect or interject, or do you just have to hear them out until they naturally stop?
Depends on the client and what the situation is. So if it's like a first time client and I feel like they just kind of need a cathartic like dump, let them have it. If it's something that happens every single session, I'm going to be like, hey, I'm going to slow you down with the check-in process. Because I have some clients that the check-in would take their full 50 minutes to just kind of come in and like and not like process any of it. They could just do a check-in for 15 minutes and I wouldn't have to say anything. But saying like, I'm going to stop you right here, or I'm going to set a limit. We're going to check in for 5 minutes, and I have done that with clients. So our check-in time is 5 minutes. Let's break that down and then like go into either something we've already explored or something from that check-in to go into deeper versus them feeling the time, and just slow them down. Like, I want this to be intentional, I want it to be meaningful for you, and so how do we go deeper in this conversation? Sometimes just saying, hey, like when Angelina was up here, one of my go-to that like I stopped myself from saying was, hey, that's a lot, why don't we just take a deep breath together? And just kind of putting ourselves both present in the moment. But it depends on the client and the situation. Sometimes I do feel like clients just need a space to like get it off their chest. But if it's like a reoccurring, it happens every single session, there are times of saying like, hey, I actually want us to go a little deeper here.
Thank you.
So with reflecting feeling, it's capturing what the client said and the underlying meaning behind it, whether or not they said that feeling or not. Sometimes you will have clients that, you know, mention how they felt, but sometimes they may have just described a situation and you can perceive what they're feeling and reflect that back to them. Alright, so paraphrasing, again, more of a summary with the client's statement, focusing on content and clarifying what's been communicated. The reflection of feeling is focusing on that underlying emotion and seeing how their emotional life, making it more explicit and clear to the client. And I forgot to print that. I mean, if we have time at the end here, I will go get it. But with practicing reflecting a feeling, you would choose a sentence stem and then like something that the client has said. So again, not thinking through everything that they've maybe have just said to you and trying to associate with like a feeling for it all, but focusing on one sentence stem and adding an emotional word or feeling label to that stem. So again, back to Angelina, it seemed like you were really stressed out with the deadline of having your first paper due. I didn't kind of put it on all of it. I could have focused on the whole day, but I really focused on just the paper being due and the stress of that with the emotion. You can add a brief paraphrase, so broaden the reflection, choosing an appropriate tense to convey immediacy in the moment, check out how they feel about it. You sometimes will have clients say like, no, I don't feel that way. And being open, being able to sit with that of like, okay, how do you feel then? You know, I've always had clients that have been able to, you know, advocate in that way for themselves of saying, no, I don't feel that way. Or this isn't how I would express myself. Bringing out positive emotional stories and strengths to also counter negatives and difficulties. So sometimes that you can have clients that you're in those negative states, but also being able to focus on positives. We shouldn't always have to stay kind of in the depths, but noticing, oh, you had a small success, you had a victory here. It sounds like you're proud of yourself and what you accomplished this week. Is that a reflection of feeling can also be an affirmation as well. So then with acknowledging the feeling, you state the feeling briefly and then moving on with the interviews, you seem to be sad about that, it makes you happy. All clients have emotional lives, whether they're aware of them or not. Acknowledging with children can be really helpful because sometimes they may be unaware of how they're feeling. And then allows a deeper exploration. So a lot of times having feelings, when we get into the reflections, it can be maybe easy to slip into a place of saying, like reflecting back and combining a summary or a paraphrase. You feel this way because of your paper being due, because of having your daughter call, because of the accident, and like put a whole summary. And a reflection can stand on its own. It doesn't need a summary or a paraphrase with it. So I could also say, it seems like you had a lot of stressors today. To Angelina's a response, and that reflection can stand on its own. A lot of times, new counselors, I find they don't think a reflection or an affirmation can stand on its own, and so they always want to either tack on a summary to the end, or they want to tack on another question to the end instead of just letting that reflection stand, letting that affirmation as a simple statement to really just bring awareness to the client and let them explore their emotions themselves. So you also may deal with some macro nonverbals that are relatively easy to see, and then even micro ones. So if a client comes into session with me and they've got their arms crossed, they're not making eye contact, I can say like, hey, doesn't seem like you really want to be here today. Especially with my adolescent clients of like, no, I wanted to sleep in, I wanted to take a nap. And I can pay attention to those macro nonverbal cues. There may be ones that are less noticeable, like I said, that may just be like, oh, they divert eye contact, a lot of times I've had clients, particular one that when we get into certain topics, they'll just start tapping their foot, like, which just should, like, it seems like you're nervous about what we're talking about, just because all of a sudden they've started tapping, that I can pinpoint of like, oh no, I'm not nervous. Well, like, your foot's going a mile a minute, and bringing that into their self-awareness based on the conversation. So noting for it and watching for a time that you can share these observations in the session. It may also be something that you don't point. Sometimes we do it in immediacy. There have been other times that I've noticed it happen 1 or 2 times. And then maybe after the 3rd time, I'm like, hey, you know, I noticed whenever we get to this topic of your dad, your foot starts going. Or you cross your arms. Or you refuse to make eye contact. And I may not point it out the very first time I notice it, but like the 2nd and 3rd time when it's a recurrent pattern, I'm bringing it back in and deciding when to share it. Displaying of emotions, observing those nonverbals. There may be times that people become tearful, angry in session, but being able to reorient and express those emotions and calm themselves down within sessions, because you don't want people leaving raw, and that's where sometimes I'm like, hey, this was heavy. Let's take a deep breath together and get yourself in a place, not to just shut it down, because we want our clients to be able to express emotions, but also knowing that eventually the session does have to end, and how do we kind of unpack a little bit, but also get them recentered and regrounded into the present moment. And so for me, it is always careful to use caution as new students, thinking through, because you guys aren't really delving into deep issues, that if you know that there's like a particular like really sensitive issue that you think may be related to some trauma, when you guys get to like session 5 or 6, come talk to me, talk to your core leaders about how sometimes we have the discussion about bridging your mock clients to a licensed counselor and providing them a referral to contact someone, because that's not a place for you to go, oh, let me dig there. Because like, oh, every time we get up to this, they have a response to. That's a place to say, hey, I know this is out of my depth for my current skill level. It's probably something that needs to be worked through in more sessions with a licensed professional. And so we will go over in your 6th session in a few weeks of like how you can bridge and provide resources to clients that you may feel, not all of you will be in that position, but like, hey, if you feel like you need additional help or you want to continue to see a counselor, I can connect you with some resources. Alright, knowing that the way we express emotion is really diverse, so the way you may express emotion and the way your client may express emotion may be different. I've had clients that they're gonna get tearful in every session. Like for them, crying is very easy, it's a natural part of kind of releasing emotion. And it's gonna be just a normal part of our counseling process. And knowing that by the end of the session, they will be back regulated and be able to go about their day. Other clients, you know, very stoic, they're not gonna express emotions, and when I just kind of like pinpoint, especially when I work with initial clients who maybe don't wanna work with me, usually it's when I can like see a smirk, like maybe I made a joke and they left, and I was like, oh no, I saw the smirk, you're done, like, and just gonna bring that into the awareness of like, I got a hook somewhere in there, because they've had crossed arms and I did something that made them laugh in our check-in process time. So just expressing how people express emotions, how they want to, and it may be different how you express emotions. So considerations with reflecting, it is a basic skill of the interview process. It's often short, and an accurate reflection may be the most helpful. Again, it doesn't have to be really drawn out. That it sounds like you're feeling stressed and sad and worried and all these things. Just focusing on one emotion. Identifying unspoken feelings can also be helpful. Not all clients are going to or want appreciate or welcome comments on their feelings, because maybe they haven't explored that in the past. Maybe they haven't really talked about their stressors and what makes them emotional. And then just even a brief acknowledgement of feeling in initial sessions can help with a deeper exploration in later sessions.
So what if you say something to a client and what you've said isn't welcome, and the comment on their feeling isn't helping them? How do you back out of that?
So usually for me, like what it typically is like, no, I don't feel that way. And I say, how do you feel about the situation? Like, tell me about how you feel about it. I'm sorry, you know, this is just what I was seeing from your body language and how you shared about this, but I can be wrong. So like, tell me how you feel about it. And just being open and honest that we're not perfect. There are gonna be times that, a lot of times I use metaphors with clients, and that's where a lot of times clients will tell you that no, that metaphor does not apply to me at all. And so one example I give is when I was working with a college student in Virginia, she was really like highly motivated. Like, I think her goal in life, I went to William and Mary and like a big political base. She wanted to be a U.S. ambassador eventually, which her grandfather had been like a U.S. ambassador to France or something. So she had like kind of grown up with that like experience. That was what she wanted as well. And so she was a freshman. She was 17 years old because she graduated early, was in college, and she was like in every club imaginable, straight A's. And then she was also like having panic attacks and having all these issues. And what she'd been referred to me was underage drinking because she'd been caught. And she was like, I was literally just trying to numb everything out, like block it. And I made the analogy of, you know, it seems like you have a lot on your plate. Like your plate is just overflowing. And could we just take something off to make a little bit more room on your plate? And she was like, I do not feel like that at all. I do not think that is my problem. And I was like, okay. I was like, so how would you describe it? And she was like, I am driving a car and I have packed my car precisely with everything that needs to be in my car to get where I need to go. I've just run out of gas. And so we changed the conversation with how she could fill her gas tank. Now later on we got to the point of, you know, if you take something out of your car, you do get better gas mileage. So that can still tie into that she did have a lot in her life and probably too high of expectations for herself and where she wanted to be and what she needed to do to get there. But the metaphor that she wouldn't accept was like, how can I put gas in my tank to keep my car going? And that was just how she like challenged it. And so instead of me saying like, oh no, this is what it seems like to me, like your plate is overflowing with things, I was able to accept the metaphor of that, and we like embedded kind of putting gas in her tank and keeping her car going through all of our sessions together, because that was the metaphor she could align with.
I know it can be really helpful too, because sometimes clients don't, the feelings are hard to identify, so we have those top 5 that you showed in that movie, and then, you know, so for example, anger is a really fun emotion to work with, I find. I'd rather, in my, you know, professional past, I'd rather have an angry alcoholic than someone who's like totally pacifying me, because anger can give you something to work with.
Oh, my favorite clients are my angry clients.
I know, aren't they
Favorite
so,
ones.
if they're not super scary. I don't wanna be shamed, but it gives me an opportunity to explore that resistance in such a therapeutic way. And a feelings chart, like if someone's been numbing their brain for 20 years on alcohol, they don't know what they're feeling, and so I find that in those types of settings, a feelings chart can be really helpful.
So in my work in alternative education and working in self-contained classrooms, I typically saw 2 types of clients. One, the really angry clients, and then the other round of that was apathetic clients who they were there just because of really work refusal, but not really violent tendencies, but they would just literally sit in class and refuse to do nothing, refuse to answer questions, things like that. And I would always say, like, give me the angry clients, because anger can be channeled into passion. They are passionate about something. Apathy is a lot harder to work with, and just lack of motivation. And not that I didn't still have success with some of those clients, but it was actually a longer road to build trust and to know that, like, oh, you're working with me, and kind of having the motivation for them in some ways, whereas my angry clients were motivated for something. I can't tell you what it was all the time, but they were motivated in some kind of way, and so that passion, being able to channel it. And so when a lot of times when I would be in behavioral meetings and they'd be like, they're just so angry, I was like, they're just so passionate. That was always my reframe of that. I was like, and we just have to find a way to channel that passion into productivity. But there can be ways of going like how, if you've always been told this, how can we direct it, how can we explore it, how can we work with it? Alright, so again, thinking through the paraphrasing versus reflecting is saying like, with Thomas, I hear you saying that your father has been drinking a long time, your mother puts up with a lot, but now he started to be violent, and you're tempted to hit him yourself. Have you heard right? In this example, you're focusing on what is happening, whereas the feeling would be, Thomas, it seems that you were really scared that you couldn't protect your mom. And this is focused on the emotion, and again, you can see it's a much smaller statement than when we paraphrase. Paraphrase is a summary, it's a little bit longer. A lot of times most of the time where I use paraphrasing and summarizing is at beginning and end of sessions. So I'll provide a paraphrase or a summary at the beginning of a session of our last session. To kind of know, like, hey, this is what we were talking about last time. These were the goals you developed. This is what you said you wanted to work on. I just want to kind of check in on that. And then I'll end our session with like, okay, we've done a lot of work today. You know, we talked about, I'm gonna go back to Angelina, same thing of, we talked about, you know, the stress of getting your paper turned in, but your pride in getting it accomplished, getting to class on time, and even having a chance to talk to your doctor. That would be a summary kind of at the end of the session if we had explored some of those themes further in a whole session. But a reflection of feeling is going to be a simple statement, not combined with a summary, and that's where sometimes we can cut off the question, we can give this whole paraphrase, and then we can tack on the reflection of feeling. And that's just a lot for a client to absorb at one time. So really looking at when you're giving a reflection of feeling, it is a short statement of the feeling, with just a little bit of the paraphrasing, but not the whole something. Alright. Don't just always focus on the negative emotions, bringing out the positive stories when your clients do have successes. Sometimes we can really get into kind of a negative cognitive style. Or with a lot of my clients when I do a check-in with them, if I know, most of my clients I do just kind of like, hey, how's your week been? But I do know I have some clients who will always go the negative and everything bad that's happened in their week. So some clients I ask like, give me your highs and your lows of the week. And tell me what was good, tell me what was bad, so that we can kind of also challenge the thought that the week has always been terrible, but what have been the highlights? And that being more of a strength-based approach, positive psychology. Alright, knowing that worry is not actually an emotion. Clients can often express mixed or conflicting emotions, and reflections can help us sort those out. So sometimes your clients will express multiple emotions. I wouldn't say like, hey, it seems like you're sad and you're angry and you're frustrated, but actually try to consolidate down to one. So again, you can focus on unpacking that a little bit. Basic emotions, those 5 that we've talked about in human growth and development, are universal, but the social interactions can have cultural implications in how we perceive them. Alright, so again, this is what you guys are going to be practicing within your groups tonight, is choosing that sentence stem as you're practicing, and I'll give the prompt later on tonight of what you guys are going to be working on. So choose one sentence that they've given, don't paraphrase everything that they said. Add an emotional word or feeling label to it. A brief paraphrase to connect with it. Don't just say, you seem sad, or you seem angry. But put a little bit of a paraphrase on there. Check out how they were feeling about that. Is that how they feel? And then also, like I said, bring up positive emotional strengths. If someone gives you something that they say like, oh, I've had a really great week, you can roll with that. You can still explore the positive. It doesn't always have to go to the negative. Alright. So reflecting feeling, you'll find that a brief acknowledgement of feelings is more appropriate. So again, sometimes you need the paraphrase to kind of connect it because you're reflecting a little bit of the meaning or the underlying tone with it. Sometimes you can say you seem to be sad about it and just show that you're present. That's, you guys are going to hear a lot throughout. It's using your own clinical judgment of how you respond. And how you respond to certain stimuli from a client and how I respond may be different. It doesn't necessarily make my way right and your way wrong, it's just practices and professional dispositions and clinical judgment of going like, hey, I reflected feeling with the last question. I reflected a feeling with a little bit of content, whereas just kind of saying, you seem sad about that. Or that seems to be weighing on you. And just leaving it at that without adding the paraphrase on it. So paying attention to increasing or decreasing your own emotional expressiveness when you watch your tapes and being mindful in a session of observing your own nonverbals. You know, are you able to make eye contact when it gets serious? Or do you find yourself averting? Because sometimes we've had the experience in our own families of like, oh, we don't talk about this. And so it may be a shift for you to put things in the present. You have to focus on your own body language of like, oh, there isn't. For me, I was like, I've tapped. And for me, that just being something that I did without really thinking about it. And for my clients, it's like, oh, it seems like you're trying to rush me out of this space. Pacing the conversation, encouraging clients to express more emotion is if they, you know, cover up your eyes of like, this is a safe place. You can express yourself here. I'm not judging you. You can slow it down. If you notice that like, hey, they're becoming more closed or, you know, to the conversation, pointing out, it's like, it seems like this is difficult for you to talk about. If they do get really emotional, helping them recenter. Sometimes you, especially knowing your guys' developmental stage, if a session does go deep, is that you can say, hey, we're just gonna pause here. You know, this seems like to be sitting really heavy with you, and not to say like, hey, I'm not gonna touch this, but like, we're just gonna pause in this moment and like, let's take 3 deep breaths together and just reorient ourselves instead of letting them continue to spiral potentially. That if you notice that they're starting to build up an emotion, you can say, hey, let's just take a moment. You just shared a lot of heavy stuff. So let's take a breather, like you can pause, I can stop the video and we can just take a moment to get yourself together and see how you're doing, you know. Because then that can give them a place to recenter as well without you feeling like you have to unpack what they're giving you at that moment, but just pause the session and just say like, hey, I just want to sit with you in this moment. Alright, reoriented them toward emotional regulation and, you know, making sure that they're in a place of like calm back down, you know, regulated breathing, and that they're able to leave the session not in a raw state. But knowing that some of you guys are going to have sensitive topics that come up, and so that use caution. You think you have the contact information. For me, you have my email one, and I am going to provide my phone number. I will say for my phone number, it's used in emergency situations that you feel like, hey, you need immediate supervision because you have concerns with a client. I should not be added to any group chats. And it should not be used to tell me you're going to be late to class, which I have had happen. That can be an email if you're going to be severely late to class. My phone number is only for emergencies, but it will be posted on Discovery tonight so that if you have a situation arise through your mock client situation and you feel that you need immediate supervision, you will be able to get a hold of it.
Can you give an example of that?
So say you have a client who, again, you guys aren't working with deep issues, but I'm not saying they won't present themselves. So say you have a client who gets really upset, you know, is crying, and they make a statement of like, I don't feel like I should be alone tonight, I'm worried, and you're worried about self-harm. Is communicating that and checking in, making sure that they have resources like the crisis hotline number, but also communicating that to me or to your core leaders to be able to make sure they're in a safe place. And that can be like calling the crisis line if you can't get a hold of me, knowing that the crisis line for King County, which will also be posted on Discovery tonight as another resource that you can connect them with.
We would do that with them there. We would let them know that we were going to reach out after they
yeah, that you are gonna communicate with your supervisor and stuff and just say like, hey, how are you doing? And creating kind of a safety plan, but like checking in with your core leader, checking in as your direct supervisors. More so, we've had issues where people have needed additional counseling afterwards. And so that's where it's been communicated of like, hey, again, that can be an email of my client would like resources in the area, and we've been able to provide that. But there's always the chance that while we have not had it so far of somebody reporting self-harm in a session, there's always the semester that it could happen. So I want you to have my number in case an emergency provides itself. But that could be one of like someone potentially disclosing suicidal ideation in that case. Alright, so just again, a little reflection summary here. Short and accurate, identifying that unspoken feeling can also be helpful. Not all clients are gonna appreciate that, but some will, and they'll appreciate receiving that early on in the session, and it may help go deeper in later sessions. So again, open-ended questions and reflections, both basic skills, but you're gonna have clients who respond in different ways to both of them. Alright, some things that we need to go over before the dinner break, because you guys do have your reflection 2 is due by next class, but you also have your first session due by the end of the week. So these are just some things to be mindful of, is that next class you'll have your second reflection. We have the voices from the field reading, but you guys also are responsible for reading sections A, B, and C of the ACA Code of Ethics. Alright, because we'll be going over ethical codes. You guys take law and ethics next semester, but we will be going over some of the basic ethical codes in those first 3 sections.
Section should cover that.
Yes. So it covers everything. So with the progress notes, you'll notice that with the reflection template, there's kind of some basic questions about how you experienced that first session, but then there's also a place to write a DAP note, which is a type of progress note. You will complete one for every session. It allows you to track your client's progress and give supports to insurance companies that you're doing work with. So some common formats that you'll typically see is SOAP or DAP. In these DAP notes, you should refer to the client as the client, not putting their name, and yourself as the counselor within the session. Some agencies, I will say, I kind of give the caveat that I'm going to teach you guys my way, but then you may, at your practicum and internship, be taught a whole nother way. I worked at 3 different agencies, and there were 3 different ways to do the paperwork. And so this is not a one-size-fits-all and will apply to every agency kind of situation. So one of my agencies, instead of client, you would have actually used the client initials is another way of seeing it. They are a summary, not a play-by-play. They should not be more than a page, and really I would say single space, they should not be more than half a page. Because while you have 1 client now, eventually you may have 6 or 7 clients in a day, and you do not have time to be writing a 7-page paper at the end of every day, right? I know that for me, and the counselors in the back will tell you, is that the paperwork is probably the least favorite part of the counseling process, but you do have to document, you have to show your work, essentially. And if you're writing long progress notes, eventually those do add up. It may be easy with 1 client. I know the first year I taught this class, I did not require a limit on it, and I got 1 progress note that was 3 pages. And that is not sustainable long-term, okay? So really the max should be a page, and really the goal being that it's about a half a page single space for a DAP note. So within that DAP note, DAP stands for Data, Assessment, and Plan. The data is the specific information that happened within the session, response from the client and the counselor. So the counselor asked what goals the client would like to work on. The client responded with blank. Counselor affirmed client's response. You can have your intervention back as well. But should be really the focus of the session. Your assessment is your assessment of the client and the session In the future, like if you're at a site that you do more of a formal intake process, there may actually be other assessment tools. So like say you use the Beck Depression Inventory in your initial assessment, you may have those scores there as well, but we won't be doing any formal assessment. So in this case, it's just your personal assessment of the client in the session. So usually that the client was oriented times 3 to time and place, and time, place, what's the third one?
Self or
Self. It pops up on my thing now. Time, place, and
Situation.
the situation. They know where they are. I'm gonna reconfirm that because I have it on my thing. So I'm saying, how was their appearance? Did they have a kept appearance? Were they unkept? Sometimes I'll have clients that'll mention that like they seemed really tired in session. Now, if you have a client, what I usually see in the first or second, I'll have something about like client reported they were stressed out. That is not your assessment of the client. That is the client's assessment of the client. So that goes in data. The client reported that they are stressed out. Now, if you notice client appeared distressed when talking about situation with mom, that didn't happen in the session, but that was just your perception of what you saw, that is in your assessment. And then the plan is the plan of action between that session and next. Specifically, if you give homework, you can mention it there. That's helpful, that if you have a client that you don't see for 2 or 3 weeks, you can go back and actually look at, hey, what did we say we were gonna do in between these sessions? Sometimes though, you don't do homework. A lot of times I don't do homework with clients. Most of my clients I don't do homework with. So what goes in the plan is just when our next session is scheduled. Client and counselor have next session scheduled for this date and time. And that's all with the board and I most of the time. Best to write in the client's own words what is going on. So if there's particular language that they gave in session that kind of stood out to you, putting that in parentheses. You cannot note everything, just summarize the key issues. It does help you to go back and review that note before in between sessions. And it should be done as quickly as possible when your memory is fresh, because the longer you wait, the harder it is to remember afterwards. Alright, just if you're curious, this is a video on SOAP notes. We're gonna watch one on DAP notes really quickly here.
Hi counselors. Today we're covering the DAP note. So the data section is basically the subjective and objective section of a SOAP note shoved into one area. You're documenting what the client has shared and reported as well as what you observed without bias. Make sure you write this section.
So again, just kind of looking at her example here. The client reported feeling sad. The counselor observed the client appeared visibly sad by the evidence of the client's slumped posture and crying. Clients say that they have tried breaking communication barrier, but their attempts. Client reported seeking a different place to decide. So it's not kind of, you see where it's a little bit choppy in the writing style of kind of summarizing those key points instead of like a specific narrative of a play-by-play through everything. So that's typical within a DAP note of summarizing those key points that I know it may not be a fluid narrative in the way it's addressed, but it's giving me the important parts of the session. But it should not be, and this one has a lot of client, but you should be mentioning what you are doing in that session as well. What is your intervention? How did you respond? And not just client, client, client without anything that tells me what you did in the session.
I see, it's only saying client, so do we not use pronouns? Like, you know, the client reported this, then he reported that.
You can use pronouns with
Okay.
them. Yeah.
Past tense, as you're usually documenting after you've seen the client. The next section is assessment. And so in the assessment section, you're providing a summary of what you really believe was happening from the data section of the note. And
And the data, they do have an assessment score here. We're not doing assessment, you guys take that next summer. But then also just what the counselor's thought process of some things that were not said in the session.
you can include a diagnosis and a differential diagnosis, as well as record any assessment instruments you used with the client and what the client scored on those.
We're not diagnosing either this semester, you take that class next semester.
The last section of the DAP note is the plan. And the plan is an area where you document what the client has stated that they will address in between sessions or upon discharge. In this area, you're going to document any homework the client agreed to do, any referrals, and the next date and time the appointment has been scheduled.
I love that.
So it depends on the organization, whether they require something that or
Mhm.
something like
Yeah, it's gonna depend on that. So just because I know that between this class and next, some of you guys may have had, you guys should be starting your first session this week. You may have already had your second session. So thinking through an outline, again, still in the exploration stage, is first just kind of doing a check-in.
You mean before our next class?
Yes.
Perfect.
So yes, before the next class, most of you will have the second session done
Perfect.
by that point. So how are you doing? What's been going on with your week? Doing a check-in. Then giving a summary of your last session. Seeing where it is, showing that you were tracking. And then starting to unpack those goals a little bit, using open-ended questions, using reflections. Really focus on staying in the exploration. Again, don't try to jump to insight, don't try to jump to action, but really flesh out what would be the goal, why is this goal important, what would be, what would change for you personally by meeting this goal, what are the steps we need to take to meet this goal, and reflecting back and asking clarifying questions.
So, if we do the goal on the second session mostly, what are we talking about for 15 minutes? on
So the first session, you're developing goals and, exploring things, but you really wanna unpack those goals. So miracle questions, seeing what they're thinking about, maybe helping them define even a goal and what it's gonna look like. But in the second session, exploring why would it meeting that goal be important and unpacking it.
Just hard to understand how
I know.
to talk for 15 minutes about something. But
And so we're gonna talk about even just their feelings of this week. Also, the check-in is part of the session. So thinking through their check-in, where they're at, you guys are gonna work on doing feeling development and like goal exploration tonight. But there's multiple ways to unpack that and explore it. And then thinking through, okay, so you've set goals, you set like steps to meet that goal. How can they go about meeting those steps?
And in the first session, do we ask them what bothers them, what they're worried about, and stuff like that?
Yeah, you can say, what concerns do you have? I wouldn't say necessarily, if you're not seeing that emotion, I wouldn't necessarily like project it onto them, but like, what concerns do you have about meeting that goal? What do you think are gonna be barriers to meeting that goal?
When you do your weekly check-ins, I would imagine, is it possible that different goals come up or they change? For the purposes of these 6 sessions, do we want to keep them progressing over time?
And sometimes your goals can change. What I would say is instead of adding them on is like thinking through that you only have 6 sessions, so really focusing on 2 goals. So if they say they wanna change their goal in session 2, or they think of like, cause sometimes it's putting people on the spot, so they're like, I said that last week, but now like I was thinking this would actually be a better goal. Okay, like we can cross that off and we can write this new goal. Not wanting to change their goals every single session, but like a one-time change is okay, but not trying to add on and again try to fit like 3 to 4 goals in a 6 session is unrealistic. So going like, hey, do you wanna eliminate this goal and edit it to this one?
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, often we will have clients that in this class who you kind of put them on the spot in the first session as goal development, and they'll come back after having time to think about it in the second session and say like, actually, I wanna change that, that's not what I want my goal to be.
What would you consider like an attainable goal for 6 sessions with a client when we haven't worked with a client before?
Yeah.
Like what is like
So,
something
thinking
that doesn't
through
seem
that we're not
unrealistic?
looking
Yeah.
perfection,
Yeah.
but just like progress and steps towards it.
Okay.
Is that any kind of movement towards that goal is success and it is progress, even if they don't reach successful completion in 6
Okay.
sessions. Cause then you'll talk about in session 6 of like, hey, this is the progress you've made on that goal in the last 6 sessions, how can you continue to make progress towards it after our time is over?
Okay, so their goal could be like, I wanna communicate with my mom better, or whatever that
Yeah.
is, and then we can like work towards that, but like, it's not like making a magic relationship with it
Yeah, and it-
necessarily, like,
Yeah, and it can be like, I just wanna work, and again, not focusing on like deep issues and say, or like saying, hey, working on specifically your issue with your mom may be a little bit too much for my developmental level, but we can just work on communication style and improving your
Cool.
communication style.
okay,
So that was
So the
general,
overall.
being a little bit more broad.
okay, great,
Versus knowing something that you probably already can feel like has a deep root.
Okay,
That you may not be able to
perfect.
get to.
Thank
So
you.
like, we can talk about
Yeah.
communication styles
cool, that's awesome, thank you.
and progress with that. And like just how you communicate, how you make friends, how you maintain friendships, and not necessarily focus on relationship with mom,
Great.
because knowing that it's beyond your level.
Right, okay, thank you so much.
Any other questions related to that?
I guess, what if my client wants to start implementing the goal right away when that's not on my agenda? I imagine it's okay to, say something like, yeah, if you wanna start thinking about how you can do that, that's great. Like, I support you in that.
Sometimes you're gonna have clients from the very beginning that like, they've started counseling, like they're really motivated and stuff, and so affirming that, like that's great that you've made success, let's like talk about, so like you did this week on their own. Again, if they've chosen to do that, you can't stop them from
Mhm.
going into that action stage without you, right?
Yeah.
But instead of like pushing them to do more action, explore what was the benefit of that action.
Okay.
How is that positive for them? You still stay in the exploration stage, taking into account their action versus you pushing them into the action stage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so if she asked me like, well, what do you think I should be doing this week? I was just thinking about what could I, cause I anticipate that she will. What could I say back to her that's not directive, that's not telling her to do something.
What's a step that you think you could make towards your goal this week? What's a realistic step you could make this week towards your goal?
Okay.
If they're really motivated to change and want to make a step, it's not up to you to like say, no, don't do that yet.
Mhm. Yeah.
More so just, it's not your job to push them in that way, but just say like, what would be a realistic step for you to get accomplished this week towards that goal?
That makes sense, okay.
And then get them to come up with their own answer. That's still remaining kind of in the exploration and saying, but if they're engaged and they're wanting to make a change in their lives, then you can support them in that way too.
Okay.
It's more so I don't want anyone like pushing someone to like get into that without fully exploring some of that.
Mhm.
Exploring the why and getting insight into their goals. But you are gonna have clients that are going like, oh, like we've talked about this and I wanna start implementing changes. You can have a discussion of like what it would look like for them to start making those steps. Alright, so just some considerations as we get into starting the counseling sessions this week. Is your midterm evaluation with the core leaders is on October 17th. So for some of you, if you see your clients every week, you're actually gonna be like on session 5 by that week, even though you're only submitting 2 videos. But really thinking that you may wanna space it out a little bit, either to like 7 every 10 days, or doing your first 3 sessions and then taking a break week with your client and letting them know, just so you can get feedback from your core leader. Because what we've had before is we've had some people that they're on their 6th session, they get great feedback from their core leader and they're done, right? Because they just did it on a weekly basis. So even knowing our classes are every other week, and so there is a session due every other week, but a lot of people schedule them weekly, and I know for time purposes, but thinking through, can you space them out a little bit, or even do your 3 sessions, take a week break, get feedback from your core leader. And for me, cause I review sessions 1, 3, and 6. So you'll have 2 videos for me feedback and be able to implement that in session. Whereas if you are already on week 5 with your client, session 5 with your client, before you're getting feedback, it can be like, oh, this would have been useful to know in session 4. Okay, so don't try to be like, oh, let me knock all of these sessions out quick. There are deadlines paced throughout the semester. I do also know that some of you guys will be done like mid-October, early November, and we'll still have like 2 more classes. You'll be like, well, I'm finished, and this was a great skill to learn afterwards. That's okay, because this is your first client, not your last client. So there are just going to be continued skills. Our last class will be mostly case study presentations, but class 7 will still be just practicing skills, even though all of you guys will hopefully be done by that point, because you will still be working on developmental skill building throughout the process, even though you're done with the assignment for the class. First client, not your last client, all right? So if you get finished early and you're like, oh, I wish I'd known that, it's something you can implement with the next one.
I had a question. You had mentioned the exploration stage, jump into action. Are you referring to the stages of change when you discuss the exploration stage?
No, so stages of change, pre-contemplation, contemplation, all that, that's with the trans-theoretical model.
Okay.
So you guys have to read Voices from the Field for the professional dispositions part of this class, but the recommended reading that's also on there is Helping Skills by Clara Hill. And she breaks down the counseling into 3 stages: exploration, insight, into action. And so that I'm pulling from comes from that secondary text.
Okay.
It's assigned.
Do you ever post like recommended readings, like how, cause I have the book, and like how far in we should be, or like?
For the Clara Hill text?
Yeah.
So if you look, this was from chapter 5 with exploration stage, 5 and 6.
Okay, great.
Is where I pulled from there. So I can pull out the recommended reading and where I'm pulling from with that, but it was chapters 5 and 6.
Great,
Is where I pulled from today. If you have the Helping Skills text. No, we.
So I'm assuming that the client does not have to role play the goal part. They have to work towards that goal.
Yeah.
Right?
Logistics where you're gonna have people who set goals and then they make minimal progress towards it with the 6th session. Like maybe it's something that ideally they want, but realistically they're not as motivated as they thought it would change. And so still being able to explore and have that exploration and that insight, even if you never get to action, that's okay. All right, we're looking for skill development, but your grade is not gonna be based on how successful your client was in meeting that goal. It's reviewing the tapes and looking at the skills that you used and whether or not you are using skills with your client. It shouldn't just be a conversation. Some of you guys, we're gonna talk about after we get into some of those initial sessions, some of your clients are gonna be really talkative. And you're gonna have to work on cutting off as a skill. Because they could fill the whole session and talk the full session, and then you have a 50-minute tape that doesn't demonstrate one skill, besides like, tell me about your day. And we're gonna have to work on how do you cut off, how do you interject to get in a reflection, to get in an open-ended question, to showcase your skills. That part is a skill that we'll have to work on with you guys depending on who your client is. Sometimes you guys are gonna have really quiet clients and we're gonna have to work on drawing out skills. It's give and take. But whether or not your client meets the goal is not going to be what's in your grade. It's going to be on your display of skills and us being able to say, like, yes, you are demonstrating a competency. Mary, and then.
I think my person might be sick. Is it okay if we're wearing a face mask while we're being recorded? Is that going to impede it?
Yeah. No, you can wear a face mask with that. Also, if your person's sick and you're just concerned, we can work on adjusting that if that's a mitigation. I've had the first year was definitely still very much a COVID year. Everybody was wearing masks. I was wearing a mask. Everyone wore a mask in class. So that's definitely something that if you feel comfortable wearing a mask, your client wants a mask. But also, if your client gets sick or something happens and you need to pause, I don't give class extensions, but I do give extensions based on extenuating circumstances to specific students when it's outside of your control to manage that session piece. All right, so that's where I wouldn't give the 10% penalty to you because your client was sick. That's outside of your control.
Thank you. It's 50 minutes, not 60, right?
45 to 50.
Oh, 45.
45 to 50 minutes.
Is that how?
So a therapeutic hour is 50 minutes.
Right.
Therapeutic hour is 50 minutes.
Um,
You get 10 minutes to do paperwork or use the
Yeah,
restroom in between sessions.
Okay.
Yep.
And then my second question was the, beginning part when you're explaining to them the informed consent, that's part of the time.
Yep.
Okay.
That is part of the time. I'm not gonna play this video, but just if you get a little overwhelmed and you don't wanna go back and watch the last hour and 45 minutes of skills, this is just a resource in here. This is about like, I wanna say a 12-minute video, but just some of the basic skills that we've already talked about so far, kind of in a short summary condensed format. In your small groups tonight, so again, this is just a reminder of what groups you're in if you forgot from last week or 2 weeks ago. You guys are going to be working on with reflection of feeling is that you don't want to just be reflecting the 5 basic emotions. You really do need to work on expanding your emotional vocabulary. So you guys are going to do that in your small groups. We do have the 6 basic ones, but thinking through that there are different synonyms that you can use, that you don't always have to say sad every time, but that to work on expanding the skill of reflection of feelings, you need to have some more feeling words to use. So you guys are going to do that in your small groups. Again, don't just focus on positive or negative emotions when you guys do reflection of feeling, but thinking of positives as well. So with the first one, with working on open-ended questions, is you guys are going to roll, if you're in the client, what are your goals for this semester? And if you were asked, what, and you guys can think about it during the dinner break, and the counselor use open-ended questions to explore that a little bit more. Why is that a goal for them? How would they be successful if they met that goal? But working on explaining, you will have 1 to 2 observers who should be like paying attention to the body language, the nonverbals that are coming across, those eye contact pieces, and noting that, hey, maybe use more close-ended questions than you thought, but really paying attention to that. Then the second one is reflecting feeling, is thinking through your past week and describing your past week, kind of like I did with Angelina. Just tell me about your weekend. Again, it can be positive emotions. And you don't have to, if you had something really bad happen this past week and you don't feel comfortable talking about it, you can pick and choose what from the past week you are willing to discuss. You can focus on the human growth and development paper if that's what you want, instead of like one narrow topic versus a broad part of your week. But find some situation from the past week that you're willing to like talk about. And in that case, the counselor and the role, you guys will all have a chance to practice that. We'll be practicing reflecting the feeling back, using some of those new feeling words that you guys have generated within your groups. Again, if you have 1 or 2 observers, paying attention to those nonverbals, feelings, the questions that are coming up, and giving that feedback within the groups. Just a reminder of like practicing that feeling stem and what it looks like. Any questions about the